fortunately, nobody's wearing a jacket. Sorry? I imagine that most of you here have seen the Tiepolo shows at the Metropolitan Museum and the Morgan Library. Am I coming across too loud, too low? Sorry? Good? Okay. I've had an echo. Anyway, the Tiepolo shows now in New York are really wonderful. They are both closing, by the way, in 2 or 3 weeks, and I urge you, if you haven't seen them yet, to go. The shows are wonderful, as I say, but in presenting Tiepolo to us, these exhibitions, like any exhibitions of Tiepolo's work, suffer necessarily, unavoidably, from a failing. Tiepolo cannot be fully appreciated unless one knows the great fresco decorations that he made in churches and palaces in Venice, in the areas around Venice, Milan, Spain, and above all in Germany. There are at the Metropolitan Museum, there is a room full of sketches of bozzetti that Tiepolo made in preparation for some of the ceilings and wall paintings that he produced in fresco. And they are interesting and telling, but they don't tell nearly enough. One must really experience Tiepolo's decorations, experience them in scale, in space, and interestingly enough, in time. Wurzberg in Germany is generally agreed to be the greatest of Tiepolo's ceilings and probably the greatest of Tiepolo's fresco decorations, I should say, not only ceilings, and probably the greatest fresco decoration of the 18th century. Wurzberg is little visited. It's off the tourist track. It's, by the way, it's about 50 miles from Frankfurt. And what I'm proposing to do this evening is to give you a guided tour of Wurzberg, to suggest the nature of the experience of being there and seeing there. It is, by the way, an architectural as well as a pictorial experience. I'm going to give you the short tour, although that may be long enough as it is. In any event, I'll try to, as I say, suggest something of the experience. Now, Wurzberg is the capital of Franconia, what was the Principality of Franconia in the 18th century. And Franconia was ruled by a prince-bishop. When Tiepolo went there in 1750, the prince-bishop was Karl Philipp von Greifenklau, which means Griffin's Claw. When Karl Philipp became prince-bishop in 1749, the palace that his father had begun in 1719 was finished architecturally, but it still needed some painted decoration. And for that, von Greifenklau called Tiepolo. The palace itself was designed and built by Balthasar Neumann, one of the great German architects of the period. Let's see. Oh, I was question here. Let's see if this works. By the way, is there a pointer or something? To point with? I can use my finger. No pointer? Wonderful. I'm showing you first can you hear me if I get away from the microphone? But I'm showing you first a ground plan and an elevation of the palace. And you see here, well, this is the ground floor here. I think, well, all right, let's see if I can. ground floor, one enters here, and here we go. One enters here through this main courtyard, one enters and makes a sharp left turn. If you go straight through, the vestibule here, if you go straight through, you get into what the garden room, the gardens, of course, are back there. But you come, the direction one takes is to go into the vestibule and then to make a sharp left turn up the staircase here. Here's the center ramp of a 3-ramp staircase. Oh, my finger is better with this. Okay, all right, here we go up this ramp. And having come up the ramp, one makes a 180-degree turn and goes up one of the 2 side ramps here to the 2nd floor. Here you see it in the, here then of course is the vestibule. One makes a left turn up the center ramp and up one of the side ramps to this space here. Then one walks from there into what is called the White Room, and from the White Room, remember we're walking this way into the White Room, then you make another sharp left turn into the Kaisersaal or the Imperial Room. Now I make a point of this because the sense of sequence of sharp turns is important. This is not a decoration or an architectural site in which you simply wander around and look here and there. There is a sense of being in a place, moving from place to place, so that one has a sense of where one is, where one has left, and one also has a sense of time. Things are changing as one is moving. Also, going up the staircase here, you can see one goes up, the staircase is also rhythmatized. One comes up the short ramp to an intermediate platform, then up again to the major change where you make the turn to move in this direction. So we come up with a kind of A, B rhythm. And that sense of change, as you'll see, is geared to, or became geared to what one saw on the ceiling above. What you're looking at actually, and this is the elevation of the palace before Tiepolo got there. And you'll see this was originally one had thought of making only kind of stucco decoration on the ceiling. Another point to keep in mind, when you're down here and beginning to go up, the ceiling is 60 feet above one. Also, the ceiling of this stair hall is enormous. It's 100 feet wide, 100 feet long by 60 feet wide, which is to say, it's a little bit shorter and a little bit wider than the Sistine ceiling. And in fact, the total square footage that Tiepolo painted is approximately the same as what Michelangelo painted on the Sistine ceiling. So it's a gigantic affair. Now I'm showing you on the right, on your right, I'm showing you the palace as it exists today, and you see there's a great open space in front of the palace. No longer it's filled with automobiles, of course, these days, but it was designed to be a great open space. And this is a 17th century engraving, and it's of special interest because until the 19th century, the courtyard of the palace was closed by a gate that you see here. And so originally, you must now visualize, by the way, this palace is set down smack in the middle of town. This is not outside, it's not like Versailles. This is really the old town, the old churches, the old houses and so on are in this area. So what one had as a visitor, as one approached, was first of all this great open space, which would have been market or whatever, and then one went into the courtyard, which is to say, one left the everyday world, the commonplace world, and entered the royal precinct. And there one entered into this large courtyard. And I'm showing you now the view once in the courtyard, and you see the main entryway. The entry bay projects forward, and notice the deep recesses, unornamented recesses down here. The whole has there's a kind of dark drama, a sense of anticipation as one leaves the great sunshine and enters into and is drawn into the darkness beyond. Here are views of the vestibule. The vestibule is quite low, heavy, with large piers, and you see these herms which on the piers which somehow help to suggest the weight, the mass of this arcaded area. If one continued now, we have just entered this way, and if one continues, of course, one goes into the garden. But here one arrives and makes this left-hand turn to the staircase. Now, from this sense of a dark, in a sense, subterranean world, one begins to climb. I'm sorry, this is the one there we go. I come back here, just one more. Yeah, here, this is rather nice because it gives one something of a sense of the dimness of the area down here and the sense of light in this distance, which it's really the light that seems to draw one to the left at this point. And now, I want you to, these are many of these views. It's really the central view that is worth looking at here. One has made the turn and is now one facing the staircase itself, and you see nothing is visible except a kind of an attracting light in the distance and above one. One has no sense initially that there's anything above, that there's anything painted. One has no notion of what the space will be as one enters and climbs the stair hall. But then, in fact, as one climbs, I want to go back here. You know, I thought I was being clever. I changed the where all these buttons are, and now I've gotten confused. I was trying to make it easy for myself, but I'm pushing the wrong buttons. Anyway, what little I want to suggest in these couple of views here is that the ceiling begins to, as one climbs, the ceiling begins to reveal itself. I might point out that there's the only point at which one can actually see the entire ceiling is at this first rest stop, one might say, on the stair hall itself. But that's an extremely unnatural view. Almost nobody ever sees that because it requires stopping at that landing, the half landing, stopping and tilting your head all the way, bending your back and head all the way back. That's, as I say, it's an unnatural view, and only art historians tend to do that. For the most part, the spectator will walk on, continue up, and the ceiling will reveal itself little by little, as you see in these views here. And as one comes up the central ramp, one is facing directly ahead the continent of America. One recognizes America immediately as an Indian woman sitting on an alligator and wearing, as you see, an Indian headdress. Above is the Olympian Empyrean, the figure of Apollo. Wrong slide again. The figure of Apollo, as you see him here and here. Now, one other point that should be made is that this is a ceiling design really to be seen in a way by almost anyone in the 18th century. It requires no special knowledge. There are no great iconographic problems, no puzzles, nothing to work out, no books that needed to be read. The material that presents itself to the spectator is for the most part, or certainly for the 18th century spectator, fairly obvious. We are looking up above, directly above, of course, is the heavens. Everybody knows or knew what Apollo looked like. He was as recognizable as a figure of Christ would be today, and then. Down below, the figure of America and the details, these were, by that time, traditional allegories of the four continents. And one has, even painted on cups and saucers and so on, one would have four continents with America represented by a figure like this. So the details of the iconography were plain enough. But the sense for the spectator is a sense of emerging out of the darkness into the day and the light. Apollo, of course, is the bringer of light and enlightenment. And we have a metaphor, basically, for a climb, the climb we have made out of the primeval darkness into the world of enlightenment, and in fact, into the world of civilization. We've climbed the central ramp, and at the top of the central ramp, one has to make now a 180-degree turn. Try to imagine this as that one of the problems. Those of you who haven't been to Wurzberg, I'm spoiling it for you, because you won't have the pleasure any longer of the absolute surprise as one climbs the staircase and makes these turns for the first time, having the ceiling revealed to one for the first time. One makes, at the top of the central ramp, one makes a 180-degree turn, and one is facing the continent of Europe on the other end, opposite the continent of, and I'll show you some details in a moment, opposite the continent of America. And you note here, too, once one has arrived at this, let us say, intermediary stage, there are levels of reality begin to mix. The statues, the reliefs, even the fictive architecture, all of this of course is real architecture, relief sculpture down below. This is all fictive architecture, relief, not relief now, fully round plaster figures on at the corners, and then painted figures, some of them overlapping the painted architecture into the space in which we stand, including figures, dogs, an entire world which shifts between our perception of the real space in which we are in and the space which has been painted. And now, having climbed the side ramp to the top, we come to this extraordinary place. We have arrived at a kind of promenade. Suddenly, this really huge tripartite staircase, three-ramp staircase, seems, as we look at it now, a quite small structure in the midst of a large plain. And in fact, the promenade, this space, these are about 13 feet wide on all sides. This comes as totally unexpected, as if we have risen to a kind of new level of perception, to a completely new area of reality. We stand beneath the heavens, and along the sides, around the sides of the vault, is the whole of the earth, all of humanity in the 4 continents. At this point, by the way, from here to the upper cornice is about 25 feet. Now, one of the things I've already indicated, but I want to stress again, there is really no single view of this ceiling that is given to the spectator. There is no way, except for that one peculiar place on the half landing on the central ramp, there is no place after that from which you can take in the entire ceiling. From this point of view, the ceiling is different from almost every other ceiling in the history of Western decoration. If you think of the Sistine ceiling, Correggio's great domes in Parma, Pietro da Cortona's ceiling at the Barberini Palace, these are, in a sense, all of them kind of pictures on the ceiling. One walks into the room, you find the place where it is appropriate to stand, and you look up. You move your head forward and backward, but you don't have to move anywhere. You might want to walk down to the end to see things more closely, but you are under one single object that you can take in as a whole. This is true certainly of the Sistine ceiling. In the case of Tiepolo's ceiling, I've already stressed the sense of the temporal. As we move slowly from level to level, from place to place and making turns, the viewer becomes a participant in an unfolding drama that takes place in space and time. And having come to the top, to this promenade, what does one do? One promenades. One walks around and studies the frescoes on the as one goes. Once more, as I say, the iconography, I'm not going to try to illuminate details. The iconography is for the most part standard, well known at the time. Much of it comes from travel books, from books of natural history that Tiepolo would have consulted. In short, the ceiling does not presume a learned spectator. There's no directed sequence. Once one has arrived at the top of this ramp, one goes in any direction one wants. There's no sequence. It depends again on the spectator as a participant to assemble the images in their logical order. Although the obvious hint has already been given, because the first thing one has seen on mounting the staircase is America. We've come from a kind of subterranean or subhuman sphere up towards civilization, up toward human activity. America, as seen first, is the most primitive, and was the most primitive from an 18th century point of view of the civilizations. And then one made this 180-degree turn, and opposite of America was the highest that civilization had achieved, which was the civilization of Europe. And along the two side walls, as kind of linkages, were the continents of Africa and Asia, which provide the transition from the utter primitivism of America to the glorious civilization of Europe. I'm choosing, having arrived here at this point, to walk down in this direction towards America. And as one walks towards America, one looks toward this wall where one sees the continent of Africa. I'll show you some details of Africa. Africa, again, allegorically, just as America, an Indian sitting on an alligator, Africa is a black woman sitting on a camel. Here, this actually belongs back down here, and the fresco is filled with details showing, as you see here, merchants, trade with Africa is illustrated, and with the great delight, Tiepolo has painted here. You see an ostrich, and there are a lot of exotic birds and animals in Africa, as in America and Asia, that are represented. Once more, the view of Africa on her camel, and so I want to start with. Yeah, what? Oh, I'm sorry. How did I go there? No. Yeah, no, I just want to stress again the interpenetration of reality levels in which you see the scene is taking place here. This is fictive architecture. We're not even quite, we don't always realize it's fictive architecture, but then from this level, things overlap. Figures sit actually on the real cornice of the room, apparently. Figures and birds, and the same, here you get some sense of how this works in its details. Having walked down the length of the room, one is confronted once more with America, and I show you here this marvelous scene. America on her alligator, and here you see it's a barbarous place, America, and you see the heads of people who have been the heads of people who have been decapitated. That's why you see their heads. But it's amusing that Tiepolo's view, of course, he never saw any Americans, which is to say Native Americans. He seems to have known that some were sort of dusky in skin color, but he had no very clear notion. And it's really a very mixed race, a very multicultural America. If you're going to judge by skin color, you have clearly a Caucasian woman here, and figures like this. I've never seen an Indian with this kind of mustachio. In fact, he looks more like a Turk at the time. But what it meant in terms of Tiepolo's and the 18th century view of the continent, it reflected, of course, a notion of the exotic, of the strange, the unfamiliar. We've just been looking at decapitated heads here, and of course America was famous as a place of cannibalism, and if you look down in here, you see that great chunks of meat are being stewed, presumably what was down below the head. And then this wonderful detail, again this play with reality. Notice now, we've got at this very corner, here's a three-dimensional stucco figure, an ornamental figure, but who exists in 3 dimensions, in the same space in which we are, and then a painted figure who leans, dressed by the way in European clothes, you see him here in detail, who leans over the painted balustrade to look in and see what's going on. He's the anthropologist, of course, who has arrived to study the mores of these Americans. He's an anthropologist who also comes with a sketchbook, which is what I take this huge book to be, in order to make a visual record of what he sees and what is to be seen. I'm not going to show you details of Asia, having making the circle, one would walk back under the wall, which has the continent of Africa, which would mean that looking across the room to the other side, we would be looking at the continent of Asia. And then directly ahead of us, of course, is the continent of Europe. And Europe, of course, is immediately familiar for... Can this be focused? Hello? Oh, you're trying, yes. No, I think it must be the slide. Well, would you focus it here for a moment? That's right. I just want to, oh, that's pretty good. Anyway, at this corner of Europe is a self-portrait of Tiepolo himself with his son Domenico. Come back to that in a general way later. Oh, well, and here, yeah, that's right, I'm sorry, we have it here. Here is Europe, which is to say Europa on her bull. You see here Europa enthroned on the bull and surrounded by the arts and sciences, the art of painting, Europe, by the way, dominates the globe. And here's in a large scene which gives you the general context. Some of this architecture, by the way, details of the architecture specifically refer to Wurzberg. So Europe is essentially the center of Europe. If the end product of civilization or of man's rise to civilization is Europe, then the end product of European civilization is Wurzberg. And the reason it is, why it is the end product is interesting. It is the end product because it is the home of the arts and sciences. And in fact, here we are. As I say, the figure of painting, Tiepolo, the painter. Here is Balthasar Neumann, the architect of the palace. This is, I've forgotten the man's name, but he's the man who was responsible for the stucco work in the palace. This is a famous composer and musician at Wurzberg. And there are other, lots of portraits of living people, the people who surrounded the Prince Bishop, Karl Philipp von Greifenklau. And his glory, and therefore the glory of Europe and the glory of mankind's achievement, is the glory of the arts. Europe is the greatest continent, Wurzberg is the greatest city in Europe, and Greifenklau as the greatest monarch in Europe because of what he has brought to the people he has brought together and the art he has patronized. No? And here, floating above this scene of Europe's dominance and the scene of Europe's art is this portrait of Greifenklau himself. Griffin's claw, as I told you, and you see the Tiepolo has surrounded the frame with a griffin in a kind of witty conceit on the name. Greifenklau crowned, and the fame, the allegorical figure of fame, trumpeting the glory of Greifenklau. Wonderful, by the way, don't miss little details. Now, the playful putti here. The ceiling is filled with these remarkable details, little witty things, interesting things, everything, as I say, from exotic birds and people and animals to these to playful putti. We've circled the stair hall now and arrived back at Europe as a high point of this civilization. And then, if you remember the ground plan, moving straight through the doors beneath Europe, one moves into the White Room. The White Room represents architecturally and pictorially, or visually I should say, a kind of hiatus, a kind of pause in the progress we have been making. The White Room, so called because of course it's painted white, and I'll show you a detail of this wonderful stucco work that ornaments the room. The White Room was not entirely white. In the room in the 18th century, when it was functioning as a true royal palace, would have been a line of guards. This was also the guard room, a line of guards standing at attention and dressed in brilliant red, red against the white. Red against the white like a sudden drum call, leading to the next movement in this progress, in this kind of architectural pictorial symphony. And to make and again, one doesn't just wander through, to make to move to the next movement. The next movement opens up with another sharp left turn. To move into that is, it's not a continuity, it's a sequence, steps that one is aware of. And we make the turn and enter the Kaisersaal, or the Imperial Room. And here is the entry doorway, faced by these windows. We come in facing these windows. This is the other side. We enter a large oval room, again, if you remember from the plan, a vast, very high room, absolutely resplendent in these pink marbles, whitewashed walls and vaults, and covered by this glittering gilding. The whole absolutely dazzling in its luminosity, its lively, luminous animation. And again, notice we've come from the so-called white room, this white and red, and we come into a room which is quite similar in terms of color, pinks and whites, or pinks and grays, the same, you might say, it's the same melody played in a different key. Here in this imperial room, glittering, the two walls, the two side walls that we're looking at are of course linked by a ceiling painting. And that ceiling painting, which I'll show you now, this is a view into the heavens. Iconographically obscured to most of us today, in the 18th century, again, this would have been entirely plain and required no special knowledge. Only three things need to be known to understand what is happening in the imperial room. One, first, the modern Holy Roman Empire, that is, the Holy Roman Empire as it existed in the 18th century, had been founded in the 12th century and was founded, or was consolidated in the 12th century when Burgundy, the Duchy of Burgundy, became part of the empire. Burgundy became part of the empire, and this is the second fact that one would have needed to know, or needs to know. Burgundy became part of the empire when Beatrice of Burgundy married Frederick Barbarossa. And the third thing that one might need to know is that Frederick Barbarossa, as the emperor, invested Bishop Harold, who was the ancestor of Bishop Karl Philipp von Greifenflau. The emperor invested Bishop Harold with secular authority, with the Principate of Franconia. Now, this is something, of course, that every visitor and probably every citizen of Franconia would have known these three facts, like our knowing about George Washington. And so looking up And the view you have on your right is the view you would get from the doorway as you enter this room. So one comes into the room and looks up, and there above one sees the figure of Beatrice of Burgundy being carried by Apollo, the sun god, in his chariot. The sun is rising now on the empire as Beatrice is carried across the ceiling to the throne of, if you can see him in this detail, to the throne of Frederick Barbarossa. And now below, the marriage scene, which would be on one's right in the room. The marriage scene is shown as a curtain rises. It's as if one is in a theater. And you see the whole curtain has lifted to a view, to a stage-like view of the historical past. And there, Beatrice and Frederick sit before the Bishop Harold as they are married. And notice some of the details again in this play. The dwarf, this architecture, of course, is painted. The dwarf seems to stand on the plinth of the real architecture of the room. Here too, this is a rather nice cover slide, and it gives one some sense of the absolute translucency in this luminous room, filled with light from the huge windows at ground level and from circular windows above. Tiepolo has painted this so that even his shadows are transparent, filled with light in the room. There's as I say, a wonderful luminosity through the frescoes as well as through the room. On the other side, the investiture of Bishop Harold as, again, the curtain lifted, as you see, by putting the scene opens on this historical event, and Barbarossa invests Bishop Harold with secular authority. Here, as in very many places in the fresco, by the way, also in the stair hall, I didn't show you any, or point out any details, there are figures, painted figures, who look down and catch the spectator's eye, so that we become participants in the action that's taking place. A dog, now like a dwarf on the other wall, seems to sit on the plinth in the room itself. And on this plinth that you see just above it, Tiepolo has signed it and dated it, 1752. And again, one has the figure of the halberdier. Notice how the staff itself seems to come forward, overlapping the painted inscription, that is the painted staff, overlapping the painted inscription once more to suggest a continuity between this space and that space beyond. I thought this audience would be particularly interested in considering a little bit how all this came to be, this fresco. Something of the technique, which is to say the technique, the means, the process that went into its creation. We have a number of drawings, and you'll see some of these drawings. In fact, I think both of these drawings are at the Morgan Library, and you see these are sketches, not necessarily for this ceiling, but they're characteristic of early sketches, drawings that Tiepolo would have made. He worked typically in ink and wash. And you see, he works thinking first just in terms of masses, in terms of the distribution of light. This especially in the case of the drawing here. one has no idea what exactly he has in mind. Clouds, there are going to be clouds here somehow or another, and we're going to have some figures. We're going to bring the figures here, strong shadows, dramatic shadows at this point. He plays to no details concerned him. Look at the way a hand is simply scribbled, as it were, enough to suggest where a hand is. What he's interested in, again, is the distribution of light. As he thinks of large masses, figure groups, and individual figures. Then comes, in fact, studies of individual figures like, this is also, by the way, in brown sepia wash, but it's a black and white slide. Here, this is for one of the figures in the Wurzberg frescoes, and you see he becomes now concerned with the nature of the pose. The pose and the definition of the figure in terms of light, rather than specifically in terms of line or contour. Then come studies like this study of a hand, or an arm rather, detailed studies usually made in chalks, in which he works out the specific details. From this point, there would also then be made, the next stage would be the bozzetti, many of which, and this of course is a sketch for the ceiling of Beatrice of Burgundy being brought to Barbarossa in the Kaisersaal of the palace. And of course there are a number of, there's a room full of sketches like this at the Metropolitan Museum, which are wonderful to study in their in actuality. All the work, and we have a good deal of evidence of this. By the way, the sketch that you see on the right is not exactly, it's not a modello in the sense of something that fixes what was to be painted on the ceiling. This is still part of the working process, and a number of changes, which are not immediately obvious here, and I don't want to take the time it's not necessary to go back and make a comparison, but a great many changes were introduced between this bozzetto that you're looking at and the finished ceiling. What this means is that a great deal, that this work of all these various stages were going on simultaneously. Tiepolo constantly changing, shifting, from even after the painting there would have been drawings like the one on the left. There may even have been drawings like the ones we just saw. And new figures introduced, new studies and so forth. Until finally, satisfied with the general scheme and the contents, the pictorial contents of the work, Tiepolo then made cartoons. Unhappily, but understandably, none of those cartoons exist any longer. There were great sheets of paper which were tacked to the wall and then transferred to the plaster surface of the ceilings and the walls, and then when then they were thrown away as these large drawings as cartoons. But we do know, and we can hear this, I've just shown you this, the stair hall of the palace was cleaned not so long ago and restored, and during the process, while there was scaffolding and so on, it was studied very carefully, and the giornate, which is to say the day's work, that is the amount of work that could be done in a day before the plaster dried, has been traced and counted, and you can see here, this by the way, this is the America section, but you can see this would have been, for example, a section of the ceiling which would have been one day in the morning plastered and then painted during the day, and that would have been the end of that day's work. The next day, somebody would have come and done maybe a small piece here, which was figured. That's what these arrows indicate. We are actually able to see, because of the overlap in the plaster layers, we see the seams, and we see which way the work went. so we can actually track beginning to the end of the work, and sometimes changes, because one of the things that happened in this ceiling, and maybe this is the time to explain it, Tiepolo, can you imagine one is working 60 feet above the ground, and unlike Michelangelo's figures on the Sistine ceiling, which after all are not basically very foreshortened. They look like, I mean, all Michelangelo had to do in a way was to lie on his back and pretend that he was standing and he was looking at a canvas directly ahead of him. Tiepolo was painting figures who were foreshortened, seen at very eccentric angles. In order to control this was a remarkable achievement. There would have been a scaffolding. There would, what we know, there would have been, if you can remember the cross-section that we saw before, there would have been a scaffolding at the height of, at the height of the cornice, the top of the cornice. That would have covered the entire ceiling. Then above, on that scaffolding, there would have been a movable tower, which he could have climbed, and that would have brought him close enough to do the job of painting. This movable tower, he could then, after half the day, he could then come down and move the tower away and see what he had done, scamper up and make corrections, and move it again. This, of course, is what he did. Nonetheless, there came days when things didn't work, when he looked and said that figure is upside down, that figure is cockeyed, whatever, and he would go up and then tear out a whole section of plaster, and one can see this now from technical examination, and redo this. As well, the painting is in pure fresco, but it's very much covered with work a secco, which is to say, after the plaster had dried, a good deal of overpaint was put on in terms of retouching, making corrections, and so forth. And I'll show you a little bit of that later. By the way, you notice that when you get into the detailed figural sections here, how small the day's works become. This, of course, is just mainly sky, and one worked like a house painter for the most part in filling in large areas. You get a sense of how the cartoons were transferred to the ceiling. Where there were architectural elements, obviously he used a rule and made very straight lines which were incised. In other words, one had the paper cartoon tacked to the plaster, and then one went with a sharp instrument went over the lines on the cartoon, incising them into the plaster itself. And here, then, working freehand, you see very clearly the outlines that are transferred from the cartoon to the plaster surface. And then one had a white surface with these incisions indicating figures in architecture. And now it was the time for color. One doesn't know exactly how Tiepolo worked in terms of transferring or creating this. He would have had, of course, his bozzetti to give him a general indication. But for the most part, work seems to have been carried out with a degree of boldness, spontaneity and freedom that is really astonishing. The speed and sureness with which he worked are very clear in detail. This, of course, is the figure of Europa again. Europa under this kind of crimson curtain or baldacchino, which seems perhaps to be reflected in these wonderful pinks that illuminate the blue robe. but the whole takes on, as one looks at details like this, a kind of fulvous quality in its strange and luminous colorism. But also, and then on top of that, you see the working with the brush and black paint, there's an instantaneity about the decisions, the drawing that is of very remarkable character. One noticeable feature, too, of the actual painting is that Tiepolo uses, to a large extent, green for shadows and green for, let us say, under shadows. You see it very clearly here in the Puto, who is almost all of him painted in green, which provides a kind of cool tone which is by itself recessive without being dark, and therefore does not interfere with the overall luminosity of the ceiling area. What you see here is a detail, I don't know if you can pick it, but under the flesh tones here is a whole area of green paint, again to deepen and create a kind of internal shadow. I mentioned that there's a good deal of painting after the plaster was dry. Much of the modeling is produced by hatching, as you see in the figure now, or the face now on the right. A variety of techniques were used for modeling, hatching being one. And here you see this, again, it's not entirely, perhaps not entirely clear, but all of the outlining here, all of this, after the fresco was finished, Tiepolo got back on the that is after the work on, after the fresco, the work on the wet plaster was finished. When the plaster dried, these outlines were all put in on top of the fresco surface. And that's also true for much of what you see in here. I show you these two details just as an indication of his painterly technique. Those of you who know something about fresco technique will realize that fresco is typically very thin and flat in its surface because, well, for obvious reasons. One is working on, it's almost like working with watercolors, but it's working with a damp surface and spreading the paint across it. Tiepolo's ceiling really looks, and certainly as we see details like this, almost as if we were working in oil. There's a build-up, a sense of facture to the ceiling, which is unusual. One detail of the figure of Asia sitting on her elephant, and I just want to show you a detail within the detail. Here's the elephant's eye. See where this, well, you can, it's exactly this area here. And as he was working, suddenly this brushstroke full of red paint is thrust. There are areas throughout these frescoes in which one senses that Tiepolo working. There are effects, as it were, which are the result of a kind of intuitive sense of something needed. Decisions undoubtedly made most often on the scaffold itself. Here is the place for an accent, a hot accent. And this, of course, has its effect only in recent times, of course, because of photography, can most of us see these details. But these are details which have their effect their effect from below. even if we are not aware or don't perceive them exactly. And these are the effects which give these frescoes a liveliness, a strength, a presence that is really remarkable, not only in the 18th century, but in the history of art. That's the end of my short tour. And if you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer.